Okay, welcome everybody to our Wild Things webinar with our project partner, Pembroke College, Oxford. We are very lucky that we have a professor from the university as well as graduates and undergraduates from Pembroke College joining to talk about biodiversity and their work and what they're very excited about in the field of ecology. Each person's going to talk you through things that are relevant to the project, some ideas that you might have be interested in for your own. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end, so ones that people have sent in and any that are asked live on the day as well. If you're watching this as a recording and you have questions for the Oxford team, feel free to send them to me or the info@researchandschools.org address, and we will pass them on. So this is our plan. We're aiming to run until about 4:15, and we'll adjust our time for questions at the end, depending on how we get on. The chat's open if you have any questions that you want to add in. So I'll now hand over to Rob to introduce himself and his work.
Thank you so much, Anne, for the opportunity. And thank you to all for attending. My name is Rob Sagaro Gomez, and I am an associate professor in ecology at the Department of Biology, Oxford, and also a tutorial fellow at Pembroke College in Oxford. Some of you may be well acquainted with the term ecology. Some of you might be the first exposure that you have to this word. So I wanted to take a few seconds before my students tell you more about this exciting activity to briefly ponder and think about key aspects of ecology. First of all, ecology comes from the Greek oikos, which means house. So ecology is all about understanding your house, not just where you live, but where every other organism across the planet lives. It's a really important science. It's actually being called to become the most important science to help us predict some of the main challenges of the Anthropocene, because the interactions of different species, which is the core business of ecology, are being more and more jeopardized by climate change and other insults that we humans are throwing into this planet directly or indirectly. Unfortunately enough, at Oxford Biology and at Pembroke to work with a large group of really talented number of postgraduate students and undergraduate students, and some of the work that you'll be seeing today has been inspired in one way or another by the ecological research that we carry out within the college and within my research group. Some of which has to do with the advance of the video is not quite moving. If and perhaps you could click on the video and see if that can move. As I was saying, some of the research has been inspired by some fieldwork that we do a bit locally in Whiten Woods. Whiten Woods is semi-ancient woodlands located a short 20 minutes away from the University of Oxford. And it is precisely there in what I like to call our backyard that we have been monitoring the responses of grasslands and other types of ecosystems like forests to projected changes in the environment, droughts, extremes of precipitation, etc., etc. So some of the work that you're going to be seeing today is actually solidly grounded on statistics, on mathematics, on the usage of drones and robots. But what I'm going to propose to you today is a first exposure to classical ecology, which has to do with the monitoring of natural ecosystems. Now I'm going to pass it on to Barbara Francic, a recent graduate from Pembroke, who has spearheaded together with other colleagues of hers in her cohorts, the efforts of monitoring in some of the ecological systems across our sports grounds. Barbara, over to you.
I think Barbara's connection might be a little slow, so I'm just going to move the slide on. And Barbara, feel free to jump in if your connection speeds up again. Barbara's been an integral member of the Wild Things project. She was one of the kind of founding members of the biodiversity project at Pembroke College, and then worked very closely with Iris to develop the materials that all of the students in schools are now using. So we're very pleased to have her here, and we'll go to Amelia and Olivia, some current undergraduates at Oxford, and they will tell you about what they're currently doing and their ideas for your projects. And then we'll come back and look at the history of the Pembroke Biodiversity Project after that.
Hi, I'm Amelia.
I'm Olivia.
And we're both currently helping to lead the Pembroke Biodiversity Project now that Barbara has graduated. So you would have just had a whole talk about the project in the past, and we would be saying that we're continuing doing things like BioBlitz surveys and working with the college to sort of assess the biodiversity at the site. And in terms of future projects, we're looking to work more closely with the university, which is very exciting. Projects such as Wild Crew and with the biology department, we're starting to get more involved with the university in the future, which is very exciting. And we're also looking to assess other types of biodiversity at the site that haven't been properly assessed yet.
Yeah, so a lot of what we do at the site is to just assess what lives there, and we do a lot of surveys, like Amelia said, BioBlitz surveys. And something we're looking to expand on is the species that we're focusing on. So hopefully we'll be looking at the bats that live on our site come summer when they start to emerge from hibernation. And we're going to buy some echolocators and record the frequencies of their like pings
Yeah.
and see what kind of species we have living there. So that's some other things that we're looking to get involved with.
Yeah, but in general, it's really important to continue assessing the biodiversity as Barbara has done in the past so that we have like a good set of data from the site. So that's one of the important things when you're assessing a site is to have continuity. So that's one of the best parts of this project is that over the last 5 years, there's been such a constant assessment of data. Yeah. So we've been hearing feedback that a few schools have had some queries about starting Wild Things projects in the winter or in schools where you don't feel like you have a lot of land or a lot of space to be able to do these projects. But we wanted to quickly reassure you that there are loads of opportunities to assess your local biodiversity and to explore it and how you can support it. And we're going to just run through a few winter, urban, and then recycled materials options for you.
Okay, so one idea that we have, the first one being a mistletoe survey. So you might recognize these sort of big green clusters that you see in trees. It's actually mistletoe. And obviously, we often think of that as something as quite Christmassy and romantic, but in fact, it's a parasite that lives on trees. And it is spread by birds who come and eat the berries, the mistletoe berries, and then they spread that from tree to tree. So you see these sort of different distributions of mistletoe clusters in different trees. And this is a really interesting opportunity to think about what could be causing these different distributions. So, for example, you could have different groups of students going out, counting the frequency of clusters observed. As you can see in the photo, they're quite fairly easy to identify each cluster. And starting to think about like what might be causing this association. Why might there be more clusters in one tree compared to another? So you may have students gathering data on the tree species itself, or the bird species that you typically find in those trees, or perhaps bird behavior. So are there particular trees that some birds are more interested in or spending more time in? So that's some of the ideas of the data you could collect, and then you could start to draw maybe some correlations in the distribution of the distribution and the number of mistletoe clusters and the bird or tree species. So that was just one idea.
I see that Barbara's back. Do you want us to continue or should we go back to Barbara's bit?
Good question. I think if you continue your bit and then we'll go back and get Barbara to talk about her project.
Great. So you may have also noticed that there's a huge increase in spider webs during this time of year, which I really like because you see all the mist on them in the morning and things like that. But it's also a great opportunity for students to assess biodiversity. So different spider families build different types of spider webs, and this is quite an easy thing for students to assess because it's so visual. And so there are broadly 8 different spider web types, and these all link to spider families. And I thought it would be quite a good winter project to assess which spiders are in your local area. And you can do this based on families. So you can have students go and look at spiderweb types, teach them the different types of spiderwebs. They can also draw these, so it makes it quite interactive. And then you can also assess if there's a difference in the spiderweb type, if it's outside in a tree or if it's within a building and things like that. So it gives you quite a lot of opportunities to look at different locations, and you can see if this varies throughout the year. So spiderweb abundance changes, or if which spider families are prevalent changes like throughout the year. And as it's such a visual thing, students can take photos as well, so they can record the data and learn processes of data recording and categorizing it based on families. So I thought it was quite a good project for the winter, and as it's so accessible because spiderwebs are everywhere at this time of year.
Okay, so obviously a lot of schools are in urban areas. My school is in the middle of a city, and that means that a lot of the time there aren't a lot of green spaces or typically biodiverse areas that you can go and look at. But there are still plenty of opportunities to look at biodiversity in an urban environment. So even things like pavement crack studies. So this might seem something you definitely overlook when you're walking along a pavement, but plants need to utilize urban environments in any way they can, and that's often seen them growing in cracks in pavements. So students could go out and they could maybe set up a transect along a pavement. They could see how the distribution of species change. They could also just count the frequency of different species that they see. And expanding on that, they could think about why it's important to have green areas in urban environments. So maybe if there were bits of land that were around their school that weren't being used, that they could maybe reinvent them a bit, and they could start to promote biodiversity on those, even if they're small patches of land, to see what species in sort of colonize that area, are the ones that are particularly dominant, are the ones that are growing faster. And if anything, it's just good to have, I think, just small patches of green space around urban environments, even if it's not from a scientific perspective. It's also just, I think it's good to have around a school area. So that's another idea that we have.
So it can sometimes feel like there are very few non-plant things to look at when you start one of these projects, but we often overlook the birds that we sort of forget about in everyday lives. So the pigeons scratching around and the seagulls. So a project on studying the foraging schedules of urban birds might be very interesting because it's very accessible. So students all know what a bird is and they all understand that they all have sort of an emotional connection to birds to an extent. And a project would be quite interesting to look at if the number of birds changes, whether or not it's break time, for example. So students could sort of record how many birds there are break time, what species they are, whether or not the frequency of birds changes depending on the time of day and things like that. And if this changes with winter, and you can tie in different seasons and like carry the study out throughout the year. Students could also look at whether or not there are different things that trigger the arrival of these birds foraging at break times and lunch times, whether or not it's the school bell or if it's children leaving their classrooms and things like that. And whether or not different bird species come on different days. So it gives quite a lot of opportunity for students to record data each day or throughout the term, that they can then assess and analyze whether or not there's an impact on the feeding schedule of these birds. But it also provides an opportunity for students to really think about the impact that people have on these species. We've altered the patterns of these birds and when they feed, and we've created a dependent relationship. And it's important to remember that our actions have impacts, that the pigeon feeding, you've impacted that pigeon by dropping your break and things like that. So it just creates an area for students to think about how we impact the biodiversity around us. And that could sort of lead students into thinking about how can we decrease this dependent relationship, and how can we make it a more stable relationship and things like that. Yeah. Should we go on to?
Yeah, and finally, some low-cost project ideas to maybe have on the school site. So on the left, you can see a picture of a bug hotel. This can be made from any sort of materials that you might disregard or not use, such as logs or bricks or sort of crates, to create this sort of stack. And this will attract a lot of different insect species to come and live there. So not only are you providing a small bit of habitat for insects, but it's also a good opportunity to maybe study them. So hand lenses, which I think are quite affordable, could maybe be used to, so say, for example, you took some insects from this bug hotel, and you used hand lenses, or you didn't necessarily need to use hand lenses, but observe them. You could do a drawing and identification of them. So you can think about what does this insect have? Does it have, how many legs does it have? Does it have antennae? What of its body structure? Does it have an abdomen? Does it have a thorax? Start thinking about how, even if it is something that they've probably seen before, like a woodlouse, really start thinking what characterizes those insects and what species it is and what other species is it related to. And also with that, students would have to think about the ethical implications of it. So they are capturing living things. How are they going to do that ethically? How long are they going to have them for? Where are they going to keep them? Are they going to what kind of stress are they going to be under? Are they going to release them back? And start thinking about how you would conduct a sort of observational experiment on them without having a lot of impact on their actual well-being. So I think that's quite a nice and interactive way of thinking about the living things that are around you, even if they're seemingly unimportant. It's still really interesting to think about why insects look a certain way they do. Where do they come from? What are they related to? Why do they have the characteristics that they have? And start thinking about sort of like phylogeny and evolutionary relationships potentially. It doesn't have to be that complicated, but maybe thinking about where do they come from and what are they maybe related to is another interesting thing to look at.
Yeah. Also, like the aim of the Wild Things project is to encourage students to explore biodiversity in their local area and come up with ways to support it. And I do get that it can be challenging to get all of this scientific equipment, and it can make it feel quite daunting if you think that you need all these pitfall traps and pan traps. But I wanted to stress that whatever you have is enough. Recycled materials that you have lying around your house, such as yogurt pots and soup pots, can be really helpful in collecting this data for these projects. For example, a yogurt pot is perfect for a pitfall trap if you don't actually have a proper pitfall trap, as the sides are still slippery and you can still collect that data and collect those insects. And for example, like the yellow plastic lid of a raspberry pot or something, you can use as a pan trap and use that to collect insects. And you can use this to monitor insect biodiversity throughout the year and things like that. And I just wanted to emphasize that this project is meant to be as accessible as possible. And I don't want people to be deterred by thinking they don't have the resources and the things they need, because ultimately whatever you have will be enough. And we just wanted to say, like, whatever you can do will be enough. And it's just a good way to get students interested in and engaged in the biodiversity around them. Yeah, I think that's all from us. If we can hand back to Barbara.
So Barbara, I'll leave it up to you whether you want to go back to talk about the Pembroke project or you want to talk about the tutorial videos first, whichever is easiest.
Awesome. So hello, I'm Barbara. Apologies for disappearing. The Wi-Fi decided to go down at the worst possible moment. I've just recently graduated from doing biology at Oxford. I've actually just started a job at UCL in neurobiology, so quite a different topic. But I'm here today to tell you a bit more about the Pembroke Biodiversity Project, which obviously has been collaborating with IRIS and where a lot of these ideas that you've just listened to kind of started and originated from. So the Pembroke College Biodiversity Project is a student-run initiative. I started it in 2021 along with a team of undergraduates. It's got 3 key aims. So the first is, of course, biodiversity protection and enhancement, so essentially a conservation aim. The second is student research, so actually a lot of what we're doing here today. So getting people out and involved in nature and actually looking at it in detail, learning new field methods, learning how to analyze data, learning how to engage with the science so we can actually use it to help protect the natural world and actually hopefully make a difference whilst also learning about what's out there. And the final objective is outreach. You can see the objectives here. I've got the presentation working. Final objective is outreach. So we don't want this project to be limited just to Pembroke. We want it to spread as far and wide as possible. So that doesn't just mean Oxford University. That means literally anyone who wants to be involved, which is one of the reasons why we teamed up with IRIS, because we want to be able to share these skills and these ideas with you. And we also want to be able to see what you can contribute and build from this project. So in terms of the kinds of things that we've been up to, here you can see a couple of snapshots of the project team. So as I said, these are mostly Pembroke College students, but we've also had members of the public joining in. And kind of going from the top left to right, you can see one of our team members setting up a mammal ink footprint tunnel. This is actually a method that you can use, and I think there is a training video on this. It's essentially a way of collecting mammal footprints to try and establish what kind of wildlife is around without actually having to catch it. You can also see transects happening and setting up of camera traps, which again, they're described in a lot of the tutorial videos and the resources that you would have received. You can see down in the bottom right, using a key and a little hand lens to try and identify meadow species. You'll probably be doing quite a lot of this if you're going to be working with plants. We've also engaged in a type of survey called a BioBlitz, which some of you might be doing, some of you might already be familiar with it. Essentially, it is a survey which looks at absolutely every living thing you can find. So we've done everything from plants to insects, mollusks, so that's your snails and your slugs, fungi, so your mushrooms, and a bunch of other species, protozoans. So if anyone's ever heard of slime molds, there's been a lot of those around on our site. They look kind of like fungi, but they're not quite fungi. So we've basically tried to spread ourselves as far and wide as possible to try and get an idea of what kind of wildlife we have on our site before we start actually interfering in it and trying to improve the habitats we have. So this is what we usually call baseline data, getting an idea of what's already there. And this is probably what a lot of you are going to be doing, at least in the first stages of your project. We've also set up camera traps, as I mentioned. Some of you might have access to these. It's essentially quite a good way of monitoring, especially mammals and nocturnal species. So here you can see we've had quite a few deer, foxes. Those two blobs in the bottom right are a mouse and a rat, which you kind of have to take my word for. But you can see a surprising amount of wildlife out and about, even in quite urban areas, if you just know where and how to look. And we've also done a couple of more kind of outreach and demonstration-based work. So this is a bird ringing demonstration. So if you're not familiar with bird ringing, then bird ringing is essentially putting on a little metal ring onto birds. The ring has a number, which means that you're able to identify individual birds using that one number. And it's essentially a way of tracking bird populations. So you can track individual birds as to where they go. So it can help you understand migration. It can help you understand foraging, so where they look for food. It can help you understand survival. And it's essentially a way of building up a picture of how bird populations look in the UK and how healthy they are. It's also a really good way of getting close to birds. So if any of you ever get the opportunity to join a ringing group, then I'd absolutely recommend having a look at what that entails. And yes, so Amelia and Olivia have already gone through our future aims and objectives. But I just wanted to emphasize at this point like how much you can do starting from the ground up. Like 3 years ago, this project didn't really exist. It started with just a group of students who were passionate about biodiversity and who actually wanted to make a difference and got together and were able to put in some time to work towards this project. And now it's grown into something that's collaborating with nationwide institutes like IRIS, talking to you guys, creating new habitats, bringing in funding, bringing in more people. So really, I don't want you to be daunted by the projects you have, rather I want you to be excited by them, because this is really a great opportunity to, 1, do some great science, 2, learn a lot of great skills, and 3, maybe start something longer that you can share with other students in your schools and possibly beyond as well. Yeah, so that hopefully gives you an introduction to how a Pembroke Biodiversity Project started, and perhaps will give you some inspiration for where you can take your projects as well. So the tutorial videos are basically there to guide you through some of the methods that you might want to use out in the field. Some of these you might be familiar with from your schoolwork, things like transects and quadrats. You've probably either used or you've read about them in the past. There's also hopefully going to be quite a few methods which you might not be so familiar with. So things like the pitfall traps or how to do bird surveys, how to find mammal footprints, that sort of thing. Essentially, the aim of these tutorial videos is to give you quite a wide range of methods that you can use. You don't have to use all the methods for your projects. In fact, some of your projects might require completely different methods. This is just a resource for you to take whatever you think is useful, modify it as you see fit. And and hopefully learn about some of the techniques which are used in ecological research, because a lot of these are, you'll genuinely find these being used by academics, ecologists, conservationists across the world. So these are techniques that you would be using if you were doing field research in the real world. And I can see here that the tutorial video that you're going to be watching is pitfall traps. So you've had a brief introduction to this. I'm not going to give away exactly what these are, but essentially this is a type of trap that is mostly used to catch insects. It's a very common type of trap. It's very often used in ecological studies for assessing biodiversity or targeting specific insect species. It's generally best for terrestrial species, so ones that kind of crawl on the ground and aren't particularly good at flying, and you'll see why. But this is a really useful method, and it's very likely that a lot of you will be using it.
So another method that students can be using is pitfall traps. It's a very simple method. Essentially, it's a hole in the ground with some cups in the hole, and anything that's walking along, so any crawling insects like beetles or other arthropods like spiders, fall in the cup. And because the cup is quite smooth on the inside, we can't really climb out. And then you come back after 24 to 48 hours and have a look at what's inside your cup. If it's a very warm day, it's often quite good to put in like a little bit of like moist sponge in the bottom so that your things don't dry out. If it's raining, you want to probably collect your pitfall traps so they don't all go for an unplanned swim. And it's also good practice to put a bit of a cover over your cups and, crucially, mark where they are because it's going to be very difficult to find them afterwards. So luckily we've got a flag, so it's relatively easy to relocate the trap. This is where the double cup comes in handy. If you want to keep the traps in for longer, you can just take out the inside cup and leave the outside cup. Oh, okay, we've got a little spider in the bottom. So we've got an ant crawling around. I think it's holding a piece of grass, or it was.
Okay, and as Barbara said, there are lots of those videos, so I will be emailing this PowerPoint and also the link to the playlist of videos around to all of the schools that are registered to do the project, so you can have a look through them and choose the ones that are most relevant to you. One thing to mention quickly, Louisa Moffat at Monsey is a teacher on the project, and just thanks to her. She was looking for sources of funding for potentially kind of interventions that she was thinking of doing at her own site, and has come across some good resources for places that you could look for that. Some of them open at different times of year. They can be a little bit labour intensive to apply to, but just to mention, if you are interested in exploring this, let me know and I can try to help you find a suitable resource that would suit for your school and what you're hoping to achieve. So with that, let's move to some questions. We've had some questions sent in advance, and we'll start to ask a few of them now to the Oxford team, and anyone who wants to from the Oxford team can jump in to advise. So the first question that we've got is, can you talk a little bit about messy data? So what if we survey one day and we get 20 birds, and then the next week or the next day we only get 2? How do you handle that when the data doesn't behave itself, so to speak?
I think I'm answering this one. So messy data often, so it's sort of inconsistent data that maybe is a bit gappy, and it might be hard to determine what a trend is if your data is sort of a little bit inconsistent. So I think the best way to maybe help prevent this or to create better data sets is to collect data over longer periods of time, and that can help perhaps even out some of the fluctuations in the data you might be having. Generally speaking, it's better to have more data than less. So being consistent with your data collection and doing it over longer periods of time. Also, maybe accounting for any confounding variables. So if you were looking at bird behavior or bird frequency or something like that, and it was a really, really windy day, then that could be impacting your data. So it's good to think about what is also going on that could be changing the data that we're collecting and accounting for that as well. In terms of actually for students to be collecting this data, it might just be good to have data sheets that have like, that they know exactly what they're collecting, and every single time they go out collecting data, they're looking at the same thing. And that might seem obvious, but that could really help create consistency, because if different people are collecting data, maybe on the same thing, you could end up with some variation because of that. So creating a framework for students to work under is another really good way of trying to get as much consistency in your data as possible. But you will have fluctuations. There will be things that are a bit gappy, but it's best to have a larger data set that you can still look at and think about, what are the trends? What is potentially impacting my data? What was the weather like that day? What are any other contributing factors? And that's probably the best way to deal with messy data.
Thank you. Okay, next question. If you had one big planter, so maybe 1 square meter or about 60 centimeters deep, what would you do with it?
So I think the beauty of the activity that we are proposing is that it lends itself to a high degree of creativity, which I think is one of the main strengths of students across the UK, right? I might want to propose that students think about the future, about what ecological systems might be threatened by in the future, and try to create the experiments that allow them to mimic what the future is going to look like now. So what are let's say, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for biodiversity in the UK? Some of the most pressing disturbances in the UK have to do with drought, extremes of precipitation, both of which, by the way, are the hallmark of climate change in much of Europe, and farming activities. As you know, the UK is under a tremendous pressure given the limited space that we have. So we have to optimize it, and there's a direct conflict between human livelihoods and farming activities. So students could think about the effects of increasing fertilization on a part of the planter and not on the other one, so that they could monitor the system so as to creating comparisons between what we ecologists would call the treatment and the control. That's just an idea. But really to emphasize, the sky's the limit. Apply creativity. I would really encourage the students to get into an experimental fashion though. So you have your control and then you have a treatment. What is your treatment going to look like?
And would it matter what species they had in the planter, or would they leave the soil bare and then just see what grew as a starting point before they varied?
Both ways. Absolutely, they can do it both ways. And again, it will depend on the specific research questions that they have in mind. So they could actually have ground soil that they collect from a nearby place, and they evaluate under different experimental conditions whether the plant community and the insect community that emerges from that varies significantly or not. Equally, they could do something a bit more ad hoc, where they would select specific types of species, different combinations of species of human interest or not, and they could evaluate what emerging biodiversity comes out of those combinations with time.
That's great, thank you. The next one that was sent in is more of a kind of a getting to know you or kind of blue sky sort of question. Do either of you have a favourite UK species, or a UK species that you think is really underrated and you think people should appreciate more?
Yeah, I think Amelia was going to answer this one, but I'll answer it for her because I know what she was going to speak about. So she thinks that moss is incredibly underrated, and that might seem a bit of a surprising one to a lot of people, but her favourite species of moss is Sphagnum contortum. And moss is actually very valuable to ecosystems because of its water retention, so it can absorb and hold a lot of water. And that can make it a really good habitat for lots of smaller species. So if we put a bit of moss under a microscope, we actually see an entire sort of ecosystem of microorganisms, some being tardigrades, which are more commonly known as water bears. They're actually really, really cute. They have these tiny little legs. People really like looking at them because they're very sweet. But you'll see this sort of incredible diversity that lives in moss. As well as that, they sort of protect things like peatlands, which is very important. Peatland bogs are very important in terms of carbon retention, like storing carbon in the ground, and keeping them wet is very important because it keeps anaerobic conditions. But moss is basically one of the most important things for that. Sphagnum contorta in particular, because it holds a lot of water, it keeps peatlands wet, and that helps carbon stay in the ground. So it's really important for that as well. It's also a pioneer species, so it's one of the first species to arrive on a uncolonized area, so a pavement or a wall. You'll often see moss is actually what's growing on it. So it's quite a sturdy plant, and it'll grow in uncolonized environments and make these environments more colonizable for other plants. So it will create bits of soil for other plants to come in and grow. So it's really important in sort of making that first step when colonizing new areas. And yeah, I think that was everything on moss. But yeah, that's what Amelia was going to say.
That's great. Thanks very much. Does it matter, or do you think you would have a preference about whether people choose a project that looks at pollinators or one that maybe looks at supporting birds? Is there a place where you would focus your attention if you were really struggling to decide between those two areas? People were thinking about like what they were hearing a lot about in the news, and people are hearing a lot about, the bees are struggling a bit or the pollinators are struggling.
Yep.
And we're also hearing about, birds and bird flu and things like that. So if people have those two areas, where do you think they should focus or could have a bigger impact?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's really down to the preference of the individual, but if you have to flip a coin, I would probably do a little bit of background reading and evaluate whether for the area of interest where your school is based, there's some records. Are there records of declines or changes in insects through time that have been published, perhaps? Or are there records of the number of bird species and how that has changed already through time? So if you're kind of like at the fence between one or the other, I would probably suggest that you err on the side of where do you already have more data to help you contextualize the data that you'll be collecting this year.
That's a really good point, actually, that background reading. So for those of you that maybe are just starting out, with help from Pembroke, we've put together a phase 2 booklet. It's on our resource centre where students can get a bit of a starting point on how to do background reading and where to look for resources and journals for that. So thank you, Rob, for reminding me about that. Right, folks, I think we can draw it to a close there. Just to mention again that any school that's registered for this project, I will send you the slides from this so you have access to any of the links that we've shared, and also the recording will be available as well. Okay, thanks very much.